On October 4, 1970, at the United States Grand Prix in Watkins, Glen, New York, a 23-year-old rookie named Emerson Fittipaldi crossed the finish line to claim the very first Formula One victory of his career. It should have been one of the happiest moments in the history of Team Lotus. Instead, when Fittipaldi rolled into the pit lane expecting champagne and cheering mechanics, he found something else entirely: silence. Grown men standing with their heads down. Engineers turning away from the cameras so nobody would see their faces. Because in that garage, everyone already knew a secret the rest of the world was only beginning to understand. Fittipaldi had not just won a race, he had just crowned a world champion who was no longer alive to accept the trophy. 1 month earlier, under the golden late summer sun of northern Italy, the man who should have been standing on that podium had been torn apart in one of the most violent crashes Formula One had ever recorded. His name was Jochen Rindt. For one impossible season, he was the fastest, boldest, most naturally gifted driver on the planet. And 29 days after his death, he became the only man in the history of Grand Prix racing ever to be crowned world champion posthumously. A crown that no living man could wear, resting instead on the memory of a man already in the ground. How does a sport allow that to happen? How does a man win the biggest prize of his life after he has already lost it? To understand that, you cannot start with the crash. You have to start with who Jochen Rindt actually was, and the terrifying world he chose to live in. Rindt's story begins with tragedy, long before he ever sat in a race car. Born in Germany in 1942, he was still an infant when an Allied bombing raid on Hamburg killed both of his parents in a single night. He was raised by his grandparents in Graz, Austria, a boy who grew up fast, restless, and hungry for something the quiet Austrian countryside could never give him. He found it behind the wheel. By his early 20s, he was already a phenomenon, a driver with a reputation for taking corners the way other men took dares, sliding his car sideways through bends at speeds that made seasoned mechanics wince. He wasn't just fast, he was theatrical. Spectators didn't just watch Jochen Rindt race, they held their breath while he did it, half expecting to witness a miracle, and half expecting to witness a disaster. And underneath all that flair was something most fans never saw. A man who understood, with total clarity, exactly how close to death he was living every single time he strapped into a cockpit. That clarity mattered because in 1970, Formula One was not the sport we know today. There were no crumple zones, no carbon fiber survival cells, no head and neck restraints, barely any runoff gravel traps, and trackside medical facilities that were, by modern standards, almost a joke. Cars were built from thin aluminum sheet wrapped around screaming engines, and the guiding philosophy of the era, spoken almost as gospel in every garage on the grid, was that a race car should be built exactly light enough to hold together until it crossed the finish line, and not 1 ounce heavier. Drivers were dying at a rate that would be unthinkable today, sometimes several a season, and everybody in the paddock knew it. They just didn't talk about it out loud. It was the toll for admission into the sport they loved. And the team that pushed that dangerous philosophy harder than almost anyone else on the grid was the very team Jochen Rindt had signed with. Team Lotus. Team Lotus was run by a man named Colin Chapman, a genius engineer whose innovations reshaped motorsport forever, and whose obsession with shaving away weight bordered on recklessness. Chapman's cars were the fastest thing on 4 wheels, and they were also, year after year, some of the most fragile machines on the grid, prone to mechanical failures that ended races and sometimes ended lives. Rindt knew this intimately. The year before, in 1969, he had already survived a horrifying crash when a poorly designed, high-mounted rear wing failed catastrophically at speed and sent his Lotus into the barriers at brutal velocity, an accident that by every reasonable expectation should have killed him. He walked away from that wreck with facial injuries, a battered body, and a warning he took deadly seriously. He had told friends, more than once, that driving for Lotus could make him world champion, or it could kill him, and there was no telling in advance which one it would be. This is the part of the story most people skip past too quickly. Rindt wasn't reckless. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what he was risking every single time he climbed into that cockpit, and he chose to do it anyway because he believed, deep down, that 1970 was finally going to be his year. But before we go any further, you need to understand something that makes this entire story even heavier, something that most retellings leave out completely. Jochen Rindt was not the only tragedy of the 1970 Formula One season. Just a few months before Monza, in June of that year, Rindt's closest friend on the grid, a British driver named Piers, was killed in a fiery crash at the Dutch Grand Prix, a race that Rindt himself went on to win that very same weekend. Rindt and Courage weren't just fellow competitors. They were genuinely close, the kind of friends who spent time together away from the paddock, and Rindt was reportedly devastated by the loss. He raced through his grief that entire summer, winning race after race in a car he didn't fully trust, for a team run by a man whose engineering philosophy had already nearly killed him once. If you're wondering how a person keeps climbing back into a machine like that after losing a friend to the exact same sport, that question sat at the center of Jochen Rindt's entire final season, and he never got the chance to answer it out loud. And it was, by every measure, his year. Lotus unveiled a radical new car for the season, the Lotus 72, a wedge-shaped machine with side-mounted radiators and inboard brakes that looked like nothing else on the grid, and drove like nothing else on the grid either. It was blisteringly quick when everything worked, and completely unpredictable the moment something didn't. Rindt drove it like a man possessed, winning 5 Grands Prix that season, including a legendary last-lap overtake at Monaco, so daring that people still talk about it more than half a century later. By the time the paddock arrived in Italy for the September Grand Prix at Monza, Rindt held a commanding lead in the championship standings. He was one strong result away from, finally, after years of near misses and heartbreak, becoming world champion. He had even quietly told people close to him that this would likely be his final season behind the wheel. He wanted to walk away at the top, go home to his wife Nina, a former model, and his young daughter Natasha, and stop rolling the dice every second Sunday. He never got the chance. And here's where the story takes a turn that most viewers do not see coming. Because the thing that killed Jochen Rindt wasn't a mistake he made behind the wheel. It was a decision made long before he ever got in the car that day. Monza in 1970 was known as the Temple of Speed, a track built around enormous, flat-out straights where cars ran at their absolute limit for miles at a time, drafting off each other in a high-speed chess match that could decide a race by a few thousandths of a second. To maximize top speed on those straights, Colin Chapman made a call that, in hindsight, reads like a horror story written in advance. He ordered the rear wings stripped completely off Rindt's Lotus 72. Less wing meant less drag, and less drag meant a higher top speed down Monza's long straights, which mattered enormously in an era when cars fought for the lead by slipstreaming one another right up to the braking zone. It also meant almost no downforce, which made the car dangerously unstable the instant a driver touched the brakes. Rindt's own teammate tested the wingless setup first and came back visibly shaken, reporting that the car was nearly undrivable, weaving violently every time he slowed for a corner. Rindt heard that report firsthand, and still, with Ferrari surging on their home turf in front of their own fans and the championship finally within touching distance, he agreed to run the car exactly as it was. No wing, no margin for error, just raw, naked, terrifying speed. If you think that's the most reckless decision buried in this story, wait. Because it gets worse. The track itself was a loaded gun waiting to go off. Monza's safety infrastructure in 1970 was dangerously outdated for the speeds the cars were now reaching. Along the fast approach to the notorious Parabolica corner, the guardrails weren't properly anchored into concrete foundations the way modern barriers are. They were essentially bolted onto grass embankments, with a gap underneath wide enough for a car to slide beneath instead of deflecting off the surface. Rindt himself, in one of the cruelest ironies in motorsport history, was one of the loudest voices in the paddock pushing for better circuit safety. He sat on the Grand Prix Drivers Association, actively campaigning for exactly the kind of barrier reform that, had it existed a year earlier, might have saved his own life. He knew the risks of the car, he knew the risks of the track, and on the afternoon of Saturday, September 5, 1970, during final qualifying practice, he strapped in anyway. There's one more detail that still haunts people who know this story in full. And it's the kind of small human detail that makes you want to reach back through time and stop him before it's too late. Rindt had a habit, one he never fully shook off, of leaving the crotch straps of his 5-point safety harness unbuckled, wearing only the shoulder and lap belts instead. He did it so that if his car ever caught fire, he could scramble free of the cockpit faster. It was a small, understandable decision, made out of a completely different fear than the one that would end up killing him. Nobody could have known, in that moment, walking to the grid under the warm Italian sun, that this one habit would decide everything that happened next. Just before 3 o'clock that afternoon, Rindt came storming down Monza's long back, straight at full throttle, chasing lap time, closing in on the braking zone for the Parabolica at speeds well over 180 miles an hour. He hit the brakes to set up for the corner exactly the way he had 1,000 times before, and something on the car simply gave way beneath him. Investigators later concluded that a component in the front braking system failed catastrophically under the load, snapping instantly and without warning, deprived of braking force on one side of the car in a fraction of a second. The Lotus snapped violently to the right, then whipped just as violently to the left, and Rindt lost it completely. The wingless, unstable car speared off the racing line at devastating speed and slammed into those poorly anchored guardrails at a brutal angle. And because the barriers weren't secured the way they should have been, they didn't do the one job guardrails exist to do. They didn't deflect the car away. They buckled upward on impact, and the wedge-shaped nose of the Lotus slid straight underneath the steel beam like a knife sliding under a locked door. The front of the car was ripped apart on contact with a support post hidden behind the barrier in less time than it takes to blink. And here is the part of this story that turns your stomach the moment you hear it in full. Because Rindt hadn't buckled his crotch straps, the violent deceleration of the impact threw his body forward and downward inside the cockpit, instead of holding him rigidly in place the way the harness was designed to do. The lap belt, with nothing beneath it to anchor his hips, rode upward across his torso under enormous force and tore into his throat. It wasn't the impact with the wall alone that killed him in that instant. It was his own safety harness, the very equipment designed to save his life, turned lethal by one small habit born out of a completely different fear. Fellow drivers, racing at full speed just seconds behind him, came upon the wreckage and slammed on their brakes in horror. They abandoned their own race, sprinted to the twisted wreck, and pulled Rindt from the crumpled aluminum shell with their bare hands, fighting to get him into an ambulance as fast as humanly possible. It didn't matter. Jochen Rindt was pronounced dead before he ever reached the hospital in Milan. He was 28 years old. What happened next inside that paddock might disturb you even more than the crash itself, because it says everything about how differently this era of motorsport treated death. Despite losing their biggest star that Saturday afternoon, the Italian Grand Prix organizers did not cancel the meeting. Race officials, drivers, and team bosses gathered that evening in stunned, muted conversation, and by the next morning, cars were back out on that same tarmac, at that very same corner, preparing to race the following day exactly as scheduled. Colin Chapman himself was reportedly in visible shock, barely functioning, before he and his team made the decision to leave the country that night rather than face Italian authorities. Some drivers on the grid that Sunday admitted afterward that they could barely focus, glancing every single lap toward the spot where Rindt had died less than 24 hours earlier. That was simply how the sport survived in 1970. There was no red flag culture, no extended mourning period built into the calendar, no counseling for the men who had to climb back into their own fragile machines the very next day and drive past the exact patch of grass where their friend and rival had just been killed. Grief in Formula One back then didn't get a pause button. It got absorbed quietly and carried forward at 180 miles an hour. You would think that would be the end of the story. It is not even close. What happened in the hours and days after Rindt's death is almost stranger than the crash itself, and it's the part almost nobody outside serious racing history circles ever hears about. Under Italian law at the time, a fatal accident on a racetrack automatically triggered a criminal investigation, and that investigation carried the legal authority to impound not just the wreckage, but potentially the entire team's cars and equipment while the case was reviewed. Colin Chapman, the man whose decision to strip the wing had just cost a driver his life, did not stay in Italy to answer for it. He and the rest of the Lotus team packed up whatever they could in the dead of night and left the country before sunrise, avoiding the very real possibility of arrest. Sit with that for a second. The man responsible for the setup that killed a world championship contender boarded a plane and vanished, while the racing world was still absorbing the news that its brightest star was gone. Nina Rindt, Jochen's widow, was left behind to grieve in the middle of a legal and emotional storm that most people never even hear about when this story gets told in passing. Meanwhile, the sport itself faced an almost surreal problem it had never had to deal with before. There were still 3 Grands Prix left on the calendar, and Rindt's points total, 45, was high enough that mathematically only one man could still catch him, Ferrari's Jacky Ickx, racing in front of his own team's passionate home fans and desperate for a shot at the crown. For weeks, the entire paddock existed in this bizarre, suspended state, watching a championship battle play out against a driver who was no longer alive to fight for it. And here comes the twist that most people find almost impossible to believe when they hear it for the first time. Jacky Ickx, the one man with a genuine shot at stealing the title away, has said in interviews since that he did not want to win it that way. He did not want to be remembered as the world champion who took the crown from a dead man. Every single race he drove in those final months, he was, in a strange and haunting way, racing against a ghost he respected far too much to beat, which brings us back exactly to where we started. Watkins, Glen, October the 4th, a rookie named Emerson Fittipaldi, driving for the very same Lotus team that had just lost its brightest star, crossed the finish line first in only the 4th Grand Prix start of his career. That win mathematically closed the door for good. Ickx could no longer catch Rindt's points total, no matter what happened in the remaining races on the calendar. And in that pit lane, instead of celebration, there was that heavy, complicated silence we opened this story with, because everyone standing there understood exactly what had just happened in front of them. A dead man had just become world champion of Formula One, and the very team that built the car that killed him had just been the one to seal it, in the hands of a rookie who barely knew what to do with the moment. Weeks later, at the FIA's end-of-season award ceremony, there was no living champion to walk up on stage and lift the trophy over his head. Instead, Nina Rindt stood in his place and accepted the championship on behalf of her husband in a quiet, devastating ceremony that stripped away every ounce of glamour usually attached to that moment. No spraying champagne, no roaring crowd chanting his name, just a young widow, a trophy that suddenly felt far too heavy for the room, and a hall full of people trying not to cry in public. It remains, to this day, more than 50 years later, the only time in the history of Formula One that a world champion has been crowned after death, and everyone who was in that room that night has said some version of the same thing since. They hope it never happens again. Here's the strange, almost unbearable irony sitting at the center of this entire story. Jochen Rindt's death did more to change motorsport safety than almost any single event before it. In the years that followed, Formula One introduced mandatory, rigorous crash testing for chassis components, so that a single failed part could never again cause that kind of catastrophic structural failure without warning. Circuit designers went back and completely overhauled barrier standards across the calendar, replacing poorly anchored guardrails like the ones at Monza with properly tensioned, deeply anchored systems, and introducing wide gravel runoff areas specifically designed to slow cars down before they could ever reach a solid object. Cockpit and harness design changed permanently, so drivers could no longer slide free of their restraints the way Rindt had. Full 5-point harnesses, crotch straps included, stopped being something a driver could quietly skip. The Grand Prix Drivers Association that Rindt had fought for finally started getting taken seriously by the people who actually ran the sport, and within a few short years, figures like Jacky would use that same platform to force through even more sweeping safety reforms. Every driver who has ever climbed out of a horrific crash, unhurt in the 5 decades since, owes some invisible debt to the tragedy at Monza in September of 1970. A debt most fans watching Formula One today have never even heard the name Jochen Rindt attached to. Jochen Rindt wanted to be world champion more than almost anything else in his short life. He got exactly what he wanted, and he never once got to feel it. He never got to hold the trophy over his head, never got to hear his own name announced as champion, never got to go home and tell his daughter that her father was the best driver on earth that year. Instead, his wife stood alone in a quiet room and accepted a crown that no living man could ever take from him. That is the story people are really telling when they talk about the price of speed in this era. Not just the crashes, not just the death counts. Moments exactly like this one were the single greatest achievement of a man's entire career unfolded in a silence he never lived long enough to hear. If this story hit you the way it hit us while researching it, there are more forgotten tragedies buried in motorsport history just like this one. Stories the sport itself would probably rather you forget, and we intend to keep digging every single one of them back up.